Have you ever had one of those neighbors? You know the type, the one who thinks they rule the roost, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, the HOA president who wields their little clipboard like a scepter of ultimate power? Well, I had one. And let me tell you, when she decided to mess with me, a quiet, grieving widower just trying to find some peace, she picked the wrong retired engineer. She cut my water pipe, a truly petty and malicious act over a bird bath my late wife adored. So, I did what any logical, aggrieved, and highly specialized former chief water systems engineer would do. I shut off her entire neighborhood's water. Oh, the irony was delicious, like a perfectly chilled glass of, well, water. What's the worst an HOA has ever done to you? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear your stories after you hear mine. My name is Arthur Jenkins, and until recently, my life had been defined by slide rules, blueprints, and the intricate dance of hydraulics that kept a major city hydrated. For 42 years, I'd been a civil engineer, specializing in municipal water systems. Chief engineer for the last 15. I understood the flow, the pressure, the vulnerabilities, and the absolute necessity of water better than most. But when my dear Clara passed, the schematics of my own life felt irrevocably broken. The house in Willow Creek Estates had been her dream, a place with a small garden she'd poured her heart into. After she was gone, I sold our larger home and moved there, seeking solace amongst her roses and the quiet hum of suburbia. I was just a man trying to keep her memory alive, one carefully tended flower bed at a time. The last thing I wanted was trouble. Willow Creek Estates. It sounded idyllic, didn't it? Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, an air of prosperous tranquility. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent, a tension that vibrated from the perfectly aligned trash cans to the precisely trimmed hedges. This was the domain of the Homeowners Association, and its undisputed, iron-fisted ruler was one Brenda McMillan. I hadn't been there long enough to fully grasp the extent of her reign, but I'd seen glimpses. The nervous way Mrs. Henderson across the street would snatch her wind chimes inside if Brenda's car slowed. The hurried manner young Mr. Lee would cover his son's portable basketball hoop after a game. Brenda was a woman who clearly thrived on control. She was in her late 50s, I guessed, with a helmet of sprayed blonde hair, a perpetual expression of disapproval, and a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to her hand. She patrolled the neighborhood like a warden, her eyes scanning for infractions, for any deviation from her pristine vision of Willow Creek. My quiet demeanor, my widower's grief, perhaps making me seem distracted or disconnected, she likely interpreted as weakness, a new subject ripe for assimilation into her perfectly regulated kingdom. The first salvo came in the form of a crisp, white envelope slipped under my door. An official HOA notice. Violation. Unharmonious landscaping elements. It declared in stern, impersonal type. The offending item? A small, weathered stone bird bath, nestled amongst Clara's favorite lavender bushes. It wasn't garish, not ostentatious. It was simple, elegant, and Clara had loved watching the finches splash in it. I walked over to the HOA office, a small, officious room in the community clubhouse, intending to politely clarify. Brenda McMillan sat enthroned behind a large desk, a pair of severe reading glasses perched on her nose. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, her eyes flicking over me as if I were a particularly unkempt shrub. "The bird bath is not on the approved list of garden accoutrements. Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3. You have 7 days to rectify." I attempted to explain its sentimental value, to perhaps request an exception. "Rules are rules, Mr. Jenkins," she'd replied, a thin, dismissive smile playing on her lips. "We maintain standards here in Willow Creek. It's what keeps our property values high." There was no arguing with that tone. Defeated and just wanting peace, I decided I'd move it. It wasn't worth a fight. Clara would understand. But Brenda, it seemed, wasn't content with mere compliance. She wanted submission, or perhaps she simply enjoyed the exercise of her power. The very next morning, before I'd even had a chance to relocate the offending bird bath, I woke to a sputtering tap. "No coffee. No soe." A quick check confirmed my fears. The water meter wasn't spinning. I went outside, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. There, at the edge of my property line, where my land met the common grassy verge, was a scene of minor destruction. A fresh trench, clumsily dug, and my main copper water pipe severed. Not burst, not corroded. Cut. A clean, almost surgical slice, though surrounded by enough disturbed earth to offer plausible deniability of a ham-fisted accident. The previous afternoon, an HOA-sanctioned crew had been working on that very verge, ostensibly aerating the common area. I'd paid them little mind. Now, the implication was sickeningly clear. I walked back to the HOA office, a colder, harder anger beginning to replace the initial shock. Brenda was there, already sorting through papers. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, without looking up. "Problem." I explained the situation, the cut pipe, the lack of water. She finally met my gaze, and the smirk was unmistakable. "Oh dear," she feigned concern poorly. "Sounds like you have a significant plumbing problem on your hands. Best call a professional. And while you're at it, don't forget about that bird bath. 7 days. Remember the sheer, unadulterated gall of it." She had deliberately, maliciously cut off my water. My water. She had no idea who she'd just provoked. The initial wave of disbelief was quickly followed by a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a targeted, vindictive act. The kind of petty tyranny that festers in small ponds of power. No water. In the 21st century. Because of a bird bath. The insult was profound, not just to me, but to Clara's memory, to the sanctuary I was trying to preserve. I stood over the severed pipe, the damp earth clinging to my shoes. The cut was clean, too clean for a random shovel strike by an incompetent landscaper. It looked almost professional, if done with malicious intent. They probably used a pipe cutter, I thought, my engineer's brain automatically analyzing the evidence. Quick, quiet, efficient. And then Brenda's smug, dismissive face floated into my mind's eye. Best call a professional, oh, I would. But perhaps not the kind she was expecting. A switch flipped within me. The grief that had shrouded me for months receded, replaced by a steely resolve. This would not stand. This was no longer about a bird bath or even a cut pipe. This was about principle. This was about justice. The quiet, unassuming widower was about to wake up. Decades of experience flooded back. 42 years of designing, building, maintaining, and troubleshooting complex water distribution networks. I'd faced down city councils, battled bureaucratic inertia, solved crises that threatened to leave hundreds of thousands without water. Brenda McMillan and her little HOA fiefdom, they were amateurs. They have absolutely no idea who they're dealing with. I went into my study, the one I'd barely used since Clara passed, and pulled out a dusty box. Inside were old textbooks, engineering manuals, and rolled-up blueprints from past projects. My fingers, surprisingly steady, traced the intricate lines of a particularly complex urban grid I'd redesigned after an earthquake scare. I remembered the emergency protocols, the isolation valve sequences, the precise calculations needed to divert or halt flow without causing catastrophic water hammer or system collapse. A flicker of an idea, audacious and deeply satisfying, began to form. I then turned to the thick binder of Willow Creek Estates, HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS, that had come at the house. I'd skimmed them before. Now, I read them with an engineer's eye for detail and a lawyer's focus on loopholes and liabilities, particularly concerning utilities, common areas, and HOA responsibilities. The language was dense, but the underlying principles of shared infrastructure were familiar territory. My first practical step was to get an expert opinion on the damage, one that Brenda couldn't easily dismiss. I called Frank Donovan, a master plumber I'd worked with for years on city projects. Reliable, honest, and he owed me a favor or two. "Frank," I said, keeping my voice level, "Arthur Jenkins here. I've got an emergency at my new place in Willow Creek. Main line's been cut." An hour later, Frank was kneeling by the trench, his experienced eyes examining the severed copper. He whistled softly. "Artie," he said, shaking his head, "this wasn't no accident. See this edge? That's a rotary cutter and a sharp one. And look at the angle, deliberate. Someone wanted your water off. No doubt about it. He gave me a hefty, but fair, quote for the repair, and more importantly, a signed statement detailing his assessment of the damage as intentional. Next, I turned my attention to Brenda's tools of destruction. The HOA maintenance crew. I saw them later that day, a pair of sullen-looking men haphazardly pruning roses near the community clubhouse. They worked with a kind of grudging inefficiency, their movements sloppy. Not the type for precise, hidden sabotage unless under very specific instruction. I made a mental note of their truck, unmarked, a bit battered. Classic low-bid contractor. Then, I spent the evening online, cross-referencing Willow Creek HOA plat maps with official county utility records. The public schematics were, as expected, detailed. I located the main water supply lines for the entire development, and more specifically, the isolation valve for different sectors. And there it was, a key sector valve, servicing a block of about 20 homes, including, as fate would have it, Brenda McMillan's own residence. It was located on HOA common ground, accessible through a standard utility manhole cover. A cover for which I possessed several different types of keys, remnants of my long career. Interesting, I thought, a grim smile touching my lips. Very interesting indeed. The valve itself, according to the records, was an older model. Potentially temperamental if not handled correctly, or if its condition was called into question. The next morning, armed with Frank's statement and a growing sense of purpose, I decided a little reconnaissance of the human terrain was in order. I started with Mrs. Henderson, the elderly lady from across the street. She was tending her petunias, her expression wary until she recognized me. I explained my water situation, omitting the more audacious parts of my burgeoning plan. Her eyes, initially sympathetic, sharpened with a knowing glint. "Oh, Brenda," she sighed, shaking her head as she invited me in for tea. "She's always been a terror, dear. Ever since her husband, poor George, ran off with that woman from the golf committee. The one Brenda tried to get banned for wearing inappropriately vibrant attire. Power went to her head then, and it's been getting worse. Mrs. Henderson, it turned out, was a fount of neighborhood history and grievances. She recounted tales of Brenda's petty tyrannies, the ridiculous fines, the vendettas against anyone who dared question her authority. She uses this dreadful contractor for most odd jobs, a cousin of hers, I think. Vinny, does shoddy work but cheap. Probably gets a kickback," she added, lowering her voice conspiratorially. This was gold. An unlicensed, favored contractor? That reeked of impropriety. My next visit was to David Lee, the young father I'd seen looking frustrated over the basketball hoop incident. He lived a few doors down. He was washing his car, his two young children laughing as they helped. He listened to my story, his easygoing demeanor hardening as I spoke. "Man, that's awful," he said, "but honestly not surprising. Brenda fined me $50 because my kid's hoop was visible from the street for, and I quote, a period exceeding 2 hours post-active play. Can you believe that?" David was tech-savvy, a software developer. When I asked if he had any security cameras, his eyes lit up. "Yeah, I got a couple covering my front yard and the street. Let me check the footage from yesterday." We went inside, and after a few minutes of scrolling, he found it. The footage wasn't a smoking gun, but it was powerfully suggestive. It showed the HOA cruise truck parked on the common verge, very close to my property line. It showed them working in that specific area for an unusually long time. And, crucially, it showed Brenda McMillan herself, earlier that day, standing near that spot, pointing animatedly towards my yard, her expression severe as she spoke to the crew leader. "Circumstantial," I murmured, but very compelling. David readily agreed to give me a copy. The final piece of my initial alliance puzzle fell into place unexpectedly. While reviewing the HOACC and RS again that evening, a particular clause about board member liability caught my eye. I remembered Mrs. Henderson mentioning a Mr. Abernathy, a former board treasurer who had resigned in protest a year ago. I found his number in the community directory and called. To my surprise, he was not only willing to talk, but seemed eager. "Arthur Jenkins, you say? Heard about your water pipe. Disgraceful, but typical Brenda," he said, his voice dry and cynical. I resigned when she tried to divert funds from the emergency reserve to build that monstrosity of a new entrance sign. The woman's priorities are all ego. Mr. Abernathy, a retired accountant, knew the HOA's bylaws and financial history inside and out. He confirmed Mrs. Henderson's suspicions about Vinny, the cousin contractor. Brenda uses him for anything she doesn't want proper oversight on. No bids, inflated invoices sometimes, I suspect. The rest of the board just rubber stamps it to avoid her wrath. He pointed me to specific clauses regarding HOA liability for damages caused by their contractors, especially unlicensed ones. He also knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking, in terms of past complaints and Brenda's methods of quashing dissent. He was, in short, the perfect insider. The investigation was yielding far more than I'd hoped. Brenda's web of petty corruption was beginning to unravel, thread by silken thread. And I hadn't even gotten to the main valve yet. Brenda, however, was not one to remain idle if she sensed a challenge, however subtle. Word must have reached her that I was asking questions, perhaps talking to her known detractors. A few days after my pipe was cut, and I had, of course, paid Frank out of pocket for a temporary, robust repair, documenting every cent, another official envelope appeared. This one was a formal warning letter. It accused me of harassing HOA-approved contractors and making unsubstantiated and defamatory accusations against the HOA board. It advised me to cease and desist all disruptive activities immediately. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Simultaneously, a new notice appeared on the community bulletin board, pinned in Brenda's imperious tone, reminding residents about respecting HOA property and personnel, and sternly warning that all complaints must go through approved channels, which, of course, meant directly to her. Her overconfidence was palpable. She clearly believed she had weathered my initial, pathetic attempts at resistance, and that I would now scuttle back into my grieving widower's shell. She even had the nerve, during a brief, unavoidable encounter near the mailboxes, to offer a saccharine, pitying smile. "Mr. Jenkins," she'd cooed, "I do hope you're managing. Running water is such a luxury, isn't it? Perhaps this experience will encourage you to be more prompt with rectifying those little landscaping issues." The condescension was a physical force. "Oh, Brenda, I thought, you have no idea what luxuries you're about to be deprived of." She was also trying to fast-track a fine against me for the unrepaired water line, creating a potential hazard, a transparently retaliatory move designed to further intimidate. Her arrogance was becoming her Achilles heel. With Frank's statement, David's footage, Mrs. Henderson's anecdotal evidence of Vinny, and Mr. Abernathy's knowledge of bylaws and Brenda's financial machinations, the picture of her malfeasance was becoming clear. Now it was time to formulate the counteroffensive. My objective was twofold. First, to ensure the HOA paid for the damage to my pipe and publicly acknowledge their culpability. Second, and more satisfyingly, to dismantle Brenda McMillan's reign of terror. The core of my plan revolved around that neglected sector valve I'd identified, the one supplying water to Brenda's own block. If my individual lack of water is a mere amusement to her, I'm used, perhaps a more widespread and personally affecting outage will command her undivided attention. It wouldn't be sabotage. It would be a proactive, safety-conscious intervention. I would discover that this crucial valve was in a dangerously precarious condition, and, as a concerned resident and former expert, take emergency preventative measures by shutting it down to avert a catastrophic failure. The beauty of it was its plausible deniability mixed with undeniable expertise. Mr. Abernathy was invaluable in this phase. His accounting mind grasped the strategic elegance of the plan immediately. He helped me draft a series of formal communications, a meticulously detailed letter to the HOA management company, a separate entity that handled the day-to-day administration but was largely cowed by Brenda, and another to every single resident of Willow Creek. These letters would outline my original grievance, the evidence of the HOA's negligence through their likely use of an unlicensed contractor, and then detail my discovery of the critical valve issue, explaining the necessity of the temporary shutdown. These would be timed to send after the valve was closed, maximizing confusion for Brenda and positioning me as the responsible party. David Lee, meanwhile, eagerly volunteered to document the valve shutdown, discreetly, of course, and to set up an informal neighborhood communication network, a private group chat, to disseminate information quickly and bypass Brenda's control of official channels. Mrs. Henderson, with a twinkle in her eye, agreed to be the concerned citizen, innocently spreading the word once the water was off, subtly directing inquiries towards that nice Mr. Jenkins, who seems to know so much about these water things. Brenda, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, continued her campaign of petty tyranny. She pushed through a special assessment for urgent aesthetic landscaping upgrades, which many suspected meant more funding for her cousin Vinny and some godawful new topiary monstrosities she admired. This, predictably, infuriated residents already grumbling about her constant fines and dictatorial style. She summarily dismissed a polite, formal letter I'd sent, pre-plan activation, requesting reimbursement for my pipe repair, her curt reply stating the matter was closed and entirely Mr. Jenkins's personal responsibility. She even escalated her personal attacks, starting subtle rumors that I was becoming eccentric in my grief, perhaps even a disgruntled troublemaker. Each move she made, each display of arrogance, only strengthened my resolve and, unwittingly, played into my hands by further alienating her from the community. The stakes were undeniably rising. I knew that if my plan was misconstrued, or if I made a technical error during the shutdown, Brenda would use every ounce of her remaining power to crucify me legally and socially. My allies, too, were exposing themselves to her potential wrath. But the thought of Clara's violated garden, of Brenda's smug, dismissive face, pushed aside any lingering doubts. This wasn't just about a pipe anymore. It was about restoring a modicum of decency and fairness to Willow Creek. And my professional pride was on the line. The shutdown had to be executed flawlessly, safely, and with the precision of a seasoned engineer. No actual damage would occur to the system. I was merely going to temporarily suspend a service to highlight a critical, if creatively emphasized by me, safety risk. The night chosen for the operation was a Tuesday. Statistically, the lowest water usage night. Fewer people would be immediately inconvenienced by an early morning discovery. Just after 2 a.m., under the cloak of a moonless, overcast sky, I approached the utility manhole cover on the common grassy strip that housed Sector Valve 3B, Brenda's valve. I wore dark, unassuming clothes and carried a discreet toolkit containing my specialized valve keys, a high-powered flashlight, and the laminated, official-looking sign I'd printed. Emergency shut OFF. Potential main valve failure. Assessment underway. Do not operate. David Lee was positioned a good 50 yards away, concealed in the shadows by a large oak, his phone camera discreetly recording. My heart beat a steady, determined rhythm. I wasn't nervous. I was focused. This was my domain. I inserted the T-key, gave it a firm twist, and the heavy iron cover grated open. Peering down, the valve assembly was exactly as the old schematics indicated. A standard gate valve, albeit an older, somewhat corroded model. Perfect. With the practiced movements of decades, I attached the correct operating wrench. Slowly, carefully I began to turn it. Gate valves must be closed gradually to prevent water hammer, a destructive pressure surge that could damage pipes throughout the sector. Each quarter turn was deliberate, measured. I could feel the resistance of the aging mechanism, the slight grittiness that spoke of deferred maintenance. Neglect, I thought. Thy name is Brenda. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the valve was fully seated. The flow to Brenda's block was severed. I placed my laminated sign prominently on the manhole cover, then secured it lightly. It looked entirely official. Back in my house, the adrenaline was now humming. I immediately sent the pre-drafted, time-stamped emails to the HOA management company and to Mr. Abernathy, who would trigger the mass email to residents at 6 a.m. The certified letters were already in the mail, time to arrive later that day. I laid out the facts. My cut pipe, the HOA's contractor, and my grave concern upon discovering the critically compromised state of Sector Valve 3B, necessitating immediate isolation to prevent catastrophic failure and widespread water damage. I stated I had taken precautionary emergency measures as a concerned resident and former chief water systems engineer. Pending urgent inspection by certified professionals, the trap was set. Morning dawned, gray, and, for one particular section of Willow Creek Estates, decidedly dry. I could almost picture Brenda McMillan, rising in her silken robe, padding towards her master bathroom, anticipating her invigorating power shower before another day of ruling her domain. The indignant squawk she must have emitted when only a trickle, then nothing, came from the faucet would have been music to my ears. Her prized hybrid tea roses, already on a strict Brenda-mandated watering schedule, would go thirsty. Her phone, I imagined, would soon begin its frantic ringing as her neighbors discovered their similar plight. Mrs. Henderson, bless her strategic soul, began her rounds of concerned phone calls shortly after 6:30 a.m. "Oh, Mildred dear, is your water off too? How dreadful. You know, that nice Mr. Jenkins, the retired engineer, was mentioning something to me about potential problems with the old valves. Perhaps he knows what's happening." The seeds of controlled information were sown. Residents, confused, then annoyed, then angry, began to emerge from their homes, congregating in bewildered knots on their lawns. They saw my professional-looking sign on the manhole cover. They started talking. The narrative was no longer Brenda's to control. It wasn't long before Brenda herself appeared at the scene, her face a mask of thunderous fury, her blonde helmet practically vibrating with indignation. She stormed towards me as I coincidentally strolled out to check my morning newspaper. "Jenkins!" she shrieked, her voice raspy with outrage, drawing the attention of the assembled residents. "What is the meaning of this? What have you done?" I met her gaze calmly, a carefully composed expression of grave concern on my face. "Madam President," I replied, my voice measured and carrying clearly to the onlookers, "I believe my formal notification to the entire HOA board and the management company, sent several hours ago, explains the situation. Upon inspecting the access point for Sector Valve 3B yesterday, I discovered clear indications of severe corrosion and potential casing fatigue." I gestured towards a manhole. As a former chief engineer for municipal water systems with over 40 years of experience, I recognize the immediate risk of a catastrophic valve failure. Such an event could lead to extensive flooding and property damage throughout this entire sector. Therefore, I took the professionally responsible, precautionary emergency measure of isolating the valve to prevent such a disaster. I produced a copy of my letter. The HOA has been fully apprised. I've recommended an urgent inspection by certified professionals before the valve is reactivated. Brenda sputtered, "You had no right. This is HOA property. You will turn that water back on this instant." Some residents, desperate for their morning coffee and showers, looked inclined to agree with her. The tension was palpable. This was the critical moment. "Madam President," I stated firmly, "with all due respect, my primary concern was public safety and the prevention of significant property damage, for which the HOA would then be liable, especially given the valve's apparent state of neglect. I cannot and will not reactivate a valve I professionally assess to be critically compromised. That would be irresponsible. Only a certified inspection and subsequent clearance can authorize its return to service now." I subtly emphasized my professional assessment, implying I was the only one on site with the immediate expertise to have made such a call. My calm, authoritative demeanor, backed by the official-looking notice and the copies of my letter now being passed among some of the more curious neighbors by a helpful David Lee, began to sway the crowd. Brenda's bluster started to look less like authority and more like panicked incompetence. The uncertainty was brief. The tide was turning. The HOA management company, jolted into action by my formal, legally toned letter and now a rapidly escalating barrage of furious calls from waterless residents, including at least one board member who lived on Brenda's block, did the only sensible thing. They dispatched an actual, independent, certified emergency plumbing contractor. not Brenda's cousin Vinny. The contractor, a no-nonsense professional named Henderson, no relation to my ally, amusingly, arrived within the hour. Brenda immediately tried to take charge, spewing accusations about my unauthorized interference. Henderson, however, was interested in facts, not histrionics. He listened patiently to my technical assessment of the valve, nodding thoughtfully. He then examined the valve himself. His eventual verdict was a masterpiece of nuanced validation for me and condemnation for the HOA's, and by extension, Brenda's, oversight. Well, Henderson announced to the assembled crowd, which now included Mr. Abernathy, who had arrived looking gravely concerned. Mr. Jenkins is right that this valve is old, shows significant signs of corrosion, and is overdue for replacement. It's not in imminent danger of catastrophic failure today, but his caution in isolating it, given his stated observations and expertise, isn't unreasonable from a preventative safety standpoint, especially if he noted recent changes in its condition. He then, crucially, turned his attention to my property, where Frank's neat repair was evident. And this previous damage to your service line here, Mr. Jenkins, Henderson mused, examining the ground, the digging looks unprofessional, very localized, odd for a standard utility repair. This was the cue. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of his former treasurer status. Residents of Willow Creek, he began, what Mr. Jenkins has responsibly brought to light is not just a potentially faulty valve, but a pattern of neglect and questionable practices under Madam President McMillan's leadership. David Lee, as if on cue, began showing select neighbors the security footage on his phone, Brenda gesturing the suspicious crew. Mrs. Henderson, her voice trembling with righteous indignation, loudly recounted the tales of Vinny, the unlicensed cousin contractor, known for his shoddy work and favored status. Was it Vinny's crew digging near Mr. Jenkins's pipe that day? Brenda, someone shouted from the crowd. The carefully constructed edifice of Brenda's authority began to crumble. Residents, now directly and unpleasantly inconvenienced, and armed with a sudden flood of damning information, rounded on her. You mean our HOA fees are paying for your cousin to do lousy work? One demanded. You cut off his water deliberately, didn't you, Brenda? Cried another. And now our water is off because you haven't maintained the system properly for years. The accusations flew, sharp and pointed. Brenda McMillan, for the first time since I'd met her, looked utterly overwhelmed, her face pale, her clipboard forgotten at her side. Her reign was collapsing in real time. The management company, witnessing the full-blown resident revolt and undoubtedly smelling a giant lawsuit if they didn't act decisively, moved to sideline Brenda completely. They authorized Henderson, the independent plumber, to liaise with the city utility department for an immediate, albeit temporary, restoration of water to Sector 3B, but only after a thorough safety check of the valve and, pointedly, an inspection of the repair to my water line. The city crew arrived. They confirmed Frank's repair on my pipe was sound, and, after some work on the sector valve, which they agreed was old but could be safely operated for now, water service was restored by late afternoon. The cost of all of this, Henderson's emergency call-out, the city utilities intervention, and ultimately, the official reimbursement for my initial pipe repair, was to be borne by the HOA. My initial goals were met with a satisfying swiftness. An emergency HOA meeting was called, not by Brenda, but by a petition rapidly circulated by Mr. Abernathy and signed by a majority of residents. Brenda attempted a defense, a rambling, incoherent tirade blaming disgruntled elements and misunderstandings. She was met with stony silence, then outright calls for her resignation. The power had shifted irrevocably. I, Arthur Jenkins, the quiet widower, was no longer seen as a troublemaker, but as the catalyst for change, the man whose specialized knowledge, deployed with surgical precision, had exposed the rot at the heart of Willow Creek's governance. My vindication was not just personal, it was communal. The satisfaction was immense, a warm flow restoring a different kind of pressure, the pressure of justice. In the days that followed, Willow Creek Estates underwent a quiet revolution. Brenda McMillan, facing overwhelming pressure and the undeniable evidence of her mismanagement and petty vindictiveness, tendered her resignation as HOA president. She did so with a brief, bitter statement that blamed everyone but herself, but no one was listening anymore. An interim committee was swiftly formed, headed by a reluctant but principled Mr. Abernathy, with David Lee, surprisingly, agreeing to represent the younger families. Their first act was to commission a full independent audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. The audit, when completed weeks later, was damning. It revealed a consistent pattern of no-bid contracts awarded to Vinnie's Value Ventures, Brenda's cousin's barely legitimate company, often for work that was either substandard or never fully completed. Funds earmarked for essential infrastructure maintenance, like replacing aging valves, had been diverted to Brenda's pet projects, the ostentatious entrance sign, excessive seasonal planting that mostly benefited Vinnie's nursery side business, and a truly hideous fountain for the clubhouse that never quite worked right. Vinnie's unofficial but lucrative tenure as the HOA's go-to guy was over. New bylaws regarding transparency in bidding, contractor licensing, and board oversight were drafted and overwhelmingly approved by the residents. And yes, Sector Valve 3B, along with several others identified as needing attention, was scheduled for proper replacement by a reputable, licensed, and competitively bid plumbing firm. The system was being flushed clean. For me, Arthur Jenkins, life settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. Clara's birdbath remained, a small, defiant monument to common sense, attracting wrens and sparrows daily. My garden, no longer a source of contention, flourished under my care. I became something of an unexpected figure in the community, still quiet, still reserved, but now greeted with nods of respect and occasional friendly waves. Mr. Abernathy sometimes called for an informal opinion on utility-related matters before board meetings, a responsibility I accepted with a quiet sense of civic duty. I had sought peace in Willow Creek, and in a roundabout, unexpected way, I had helped forge it, not just for myself, but for my neighbors too. There was a new sense of community, of shared empowerment. People started talking to each other more, organizing block parties instead of filing complaints. The oppressive cloud of Brenda's arbitrary rule had lifted, replaced by a more breathable atmosphere of cooperation. It wasn't the retirement I had envisioned, but in standing up for Clara's memory and for simple fairness, I'd found a renewed, if modest, sense of purpose. As for Brenda McMillan, her downfall was as complete as it was public within the confines of Willow Creek. Stripped of her power, exposed as a petty tyrant and a poor steward of community funds, she became a pariah. The deferential greetings ceased, replaced by averted gazes or polite, cool nods. Her meticulously maintained lawn began to look a little less perfect, her own adherence to the myriad of rules she'd once enforced so zealously, perceptibly slackening. Within 6 months, a for-sale sign appeared in front of her house. It sold relatively quickly, though Mr. Abernathy later told me, with a hint of dry satisfaction, that she'd had to accept an offer slightly below market value due to what the realtor tactfully termed recent administrative upheaval in the community association. The last I saw of her, she was driving away in a moving van, her helmet of hair looking slightly deflated, her expression unreadable. Many of the frivolous fines she had levied in her final months were quietly reviewed and rescinded by the new board. Looking back, it's clear that sometimes, to restore the natural flow of things, you first have to strategically interrupt it. Brenda McMillan underestimated the quiet man tending his late wife's garden. She saw grief and assumed weakness, saw meticulousness and mistook it for fussiness. She never imagined that beneath the surface lay decades of specialized knowledge, a deep-seated respect for order and function, and a resolute moral compass. There's a profound satisfaction in seeing arrogance and abuse of power undone not by brute force, but by the quiet application of intelligence and the turning of an antagonist's own tools, in this case, neglect and procedure, against them. Justice, like water, can eventually find its level, sometimes with a little expert guidance. I often sit by Clara's bird bath now, watching the light dapple through the leaves, and I think she would have approved. Not of the conflict, perhaps, but of the outcome: a home, a garden, and a community where peace and fairness could finally take root and grow. So, that's my story of HOA, Karen, and the Great Water Shutoff. It just goes to show you that you should never underestimate the quiet ones, especially if they know a thing or two about plumbing. What did you think of my solution? Would you have done something different? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice served, sometimes cold, sometimes with a little bit of hydraulic pressure. Remember, folks, knowledge is power, and sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to turn off their water, figuratively or, well, literally. Thanks for listening, and I hope this story reminds you that even in the face of petty tyranny, a little bit of strategic thinking can go a long, long way.